the rest of my statement, Mr. Speaker, allow me to state that during the preparation of this budget, I had very fruitful engagements with diverse stakeholders and received valuable feedback. The breadth of the stakeholders spanned from the government ministries, departments and agencies, county government, committees of this House, development partners, private sector, and Kenyans from all walks of life. I extend my sincere gratitude to them for their views and useful suggestions which inform the priorities of this budget. Mr. Speaker, pressing concerns raised by Kenyans during the consultation process revolved around the impact of COVID-19 and its containment measures. Kenyans were concerned about the high cost of COVID-19 treatment and availability of vaccines, in addition to food security, high cost of living, and employment levels among the youth. In addition, Kenyans raised concerns about the general levels of poverty and inequality, as well as increased public debt. Mr. Speaker, at the outset, I wish to assure Kenyans that these concerns have been considered, and I will be elaborating specific interventions later in this statement. Mr. Speaker, as you recall, following the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic in March last year, the government instituted containment measures to curb the spread of the virus and save lives. To cushion Kenyans and businesses, the government rolled out specific fiscal interventions, including reduction of pay-as-you-earn and corporate tax from 30 to 25%, value-added tax from 16 to 14%, and turnover tax from 3 to 1%. The government also offered 100% tax relief to Kenyans earning below Kenya shilling 24,000 per month. In addition, the government enhanced cash transfer allocations to the vulnerable segment of the society, including the emerging urban vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, the government further implemented various monetary policy measures to enhance access to credit by the private sector. These included reduction of the central bank rate from 8.25 to 7%, and lowering of the cash reserve ratio from 5.2 to 4.2%, thereby injecting an additional shilling 35 billion to the money market. Further, during this period, commercial banks were allowed flexibility with regard to requirements for loan classification and provisioning. Mr. Speaker, to spur economic activities in the country, the government implemented a comprehensive economic stimulus program targeting activities in infrastructure, education, health, business liquidity, agriculture and food security, tourism, manufacturing, environment, water and sanitation. Mr. Speaker, in spite of these interventions, a lot remains to be done in order to deal with the challenges of unemployment among our youth, as well as high poverty and income inequality levels that have been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Our rallying call in this year's budget is therefore job creation through continued and sustained economic growth. To strengthen this position, we shall implement comprehensive economic recovery strategy that will expand economic activities and address these challenges. Mr. Speaker, the private sector remains key to employment creation and poverty reduction in the country. In order to expand the scope and pace of policy interventions and enhance access to credit by businesses, the government established the Credit Guarantee Scheme to de-risk lending to the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Mr. Speaker, the plight of the vulnerable in our society, particularly the emerging urban vulnerable, remains a key concern for our government. In order to cushion this particular group, the government will enhance cash transfer allocations and institute other targeted interventions in this budget. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic has triggered one of the worst health and economic crises of our time. The pandemic overstretched our health systems, and in line with the advisory of the World Health Organization, the government implemented appropriate interventions to save lives. The response has undoubtedly strengthened our healthcare system through provisioning of necessary medical supplies, installation of modern equipment, and deployment of more health personnel. In addition, in March 2021, the government launched the National COVID-19 Vaccination Program, initially targeting the frontline workers and other highly vulnerable groups. As at end of May 2021, about 1 million persons had received the first vaccine dose. In order to facilitate further rollout of vaccines to create herd immunity, we propose to allocate Kenya shilling 14.3 billion in the financial 2021-22. This is in addition to Kenya shilling 7.6 billion appropriated in the current budget. Mr. Speaker, to enhance access to affordable medical and equipment for management of COVID-19 and chronic diseases, I will later in this statement be proposing tax relief measures on the various pharmaceutical products and medical equipment. Mr. Speaker, the containment measures instituted by the government to stem the spread of the virus and save lives adversely affected economic activities and revenue performance. To stimulate economic activities and enhance government's ability to respond, we prioritized health and social expenditures and formulated an economic recovery strategy program that targeted, first, enhancing our ability to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, reducing debt vulnerabilities through a revenue-driven fiscal consolidation with a view to stabilizing debt to GDP ratio over the medium term. Third, implementing targeted policy, legal and institutional reforms, while at the same time addressing vulnerabilities in the state-owned enterprises worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. And fourth, strengthening the monetary policy framework and financial stability. Mr. Speaker, under the to reduce the level of fiscal deficit from 8.7% of GDP in the current budget to 7.5% of GDP in the financial 2021-22, and further to 3.6% of GDP in the financial year 2024-25. This will be a 5.1% reduction in fiscal deficit over the next 4 years, thereby slowing the annual growth of debt. Upon our request, this economic recovery program is supported by multilateral and bilateral development partners, with the International Monetary Fund providing financial resources amounting to US dollars 2.34 billion over the next 3 years. Further, Mr. Speaker, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the G20 countries extended support to developing countries by offering debt service suspension under the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative framework. The fiscal space created under this initiative is to increase social, health, and economic spending in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Kenya has benefited from this initiative through expansion of health and social services. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, Kenya welcomes the initiatives under the recent French African Summit that agreed to, among others, increase funding through the IMF special drawing rights to African states to support economic recovery, extension of the G20 debt service suspension, and facilitate the manufacture of vaccines in Africa. Mr. Speaker, I will now highlight the economic policy context in which this budget has been prepared. Mr. Speaker, this year's budget has been prepared against a backdrop of projected global economic recovery. This is despite the emergence of COVID-19 variant, occasioning reintroduction of containment measures to further stem spread of the virus. The projected recovery reflects additional fiscal support in a few large economies and monetary easing that further uplifts the economic outlook. This outlook is further supported by the ongoing vaccinations, which is expected to pick up in the second half of 2021. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, the global economy is projected to grow by 6% in 2021, from a contraction of 3.3% in 2020. Mr. Speaker, closer home, due to improved exports and commodity prices, economic growth in the sub-Saharan Africa region is projected to expand by 3.4% in 2021, from a contraction of 1.9% in 2020. This growth will also be supported by recovery in both private consumption and investment as the economies reopen. Mr. Speaker, like the rest of the world, our economy was not spared from the adverse impact of the pandemic. In addition, the Kenyan economy experienced two other shocks. One, the invasion of the desert locusts that damaged crops, and two, floods that caused loss of lives and livelihoods, displacement of people, and destruction of infrastructure. Given the economic growth for 2020 declined to 0.6% from 5.4% in 2019. Mr. Speaker, economic growth is expected to rebound to 6.6% in 2020, supporting agricultural output. As a result, export of goods and services will expand as global demand normalizes. Over the medium term, the economy is expected to remain resilient and grow at a rate above